Welcome. We're going to give a few seconds for more attendees to join us. So, welcome to Social Emotional Learning Competencies webinar series part 5, self-awareness. For those of you who've been with us for the whole series, the format is the same. We will do question and answers in the question and answer box at the bottom of the ribbon, of the Zoom ribbon. And in the chat window, as you're joining us, if you want to introduce yourself and say hello and where you are, that would also be great. And we're going to give a few more seconds to get started, and then I'll let Clark take it away. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. And thank you all for coming today. We appreciate your participation in this webinar series. I'm really excited about today because self-awareness, in my view, is actually one of the more challenging of the SEL competencies and the competencies that are reflected in state social and emotional learning standards. You might be saying, well, what are you talking about, Clark? Self-awareness is pretty straightforward. Well, I'll elaborate a little bit on what I mean by that in a second, but just to try to personalize the challenge of self-awareness, I want to ask you all a question. So, Rebecca, if you could launch the poll, that would be great. Okay, so really, if we think about self-awareness as being about awareness of our strengths and weaknesses, I want to ask you, how aware do you think you are of your strengths and weaknesses? Are you exquisitely aware of the good, the bad, and the ugly? Are you pretty clued in about your strengths and weaknesses? Could you stand to dust off the mirror and do some self-reflection? Or are you blissfully unaware? Go ahead and click the one that you think is most true of you.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll.
Okay, well, this is very interesting. What I would expect from awesome educators, that most feel that they're pretty clued in about their strengths and weaknesses or are very aware of themselves. Some, perhaps the most self-aware, I don't know, acknowledge that they might have to dust off the mirror and do some self-reflection. And, you know, one of the things that I think that's really, really interesting, nobody acknowledged blissful unawareness. I suppose you'd be unaware if you were blissfully unaware, so it's a bit of a contradictory question. But one of the things about self-awareness that's super hard is really knowing your own strengths and weaknesses. If somebody said to you, how good are you at fill in the blanks, you know, content area? Well, there are some areas where it might be straightforward to answer that because you'd have some objective measure of that area. Like, let's say somebody said, how good are you at differential calculus? You'd probably be able to give a good answer because you have some direct knowledge, some feedback from your studies about how good you are at differential calculus. If somebody said to you, how good are you at reading other people's emotions? That would be a little harder, I should think, because although it's possible to assess that competence, it's often difficult for us to know how good we are at those kinds of competencies. So we're going to talk a little bit about self-awareness. We're going to talk about what it is. We're going to talk about how you assess it, given this challenge of actually knowing. and then some strategies that we might use to actually address self-awareness and support increased self-awareness in students. If I can advance the slide, I will. There we go. Okay, so I want to acknowledge our wonderful partnership with the Traverse Bay Area Intermediate School District. Now, the picture shows Paul Bauer, who's the Director of Instructional Services, who has been on the webinar series up till now. Today, Paul was unavailable for our webinar series, so his colleague and our friend Ryan Moss is standing in his stead. So I want to thank Ryan for being here today, and thank TBA for their partnership in this and all things. Okay, so we're going to talk about self-awareness. Well, as we've sort of discussed in past installments of this webinar series, self-awareness is, yes, it's part of the Michigan standards, and we'll talk about specific competencies as they're described in the Michigan standards. But as with the other competencies we've discussed, this is really not just about Michigan. Self-awareness is one of the 5 core competencies that CASEL describes as being important to children's and really adults' ability to succeed in school and life. So this is a generally relevant competence, not just for Michigan, but really in any state where there are SEL standards, and really any district or classroom where you care to promote student social and emotional competence. So this is the sort of general descriptors of the competencies that students should know and be able to demonstrate around self-awareness as it's articulated in the Michigan standards. Now, there are a lot of pieces of this, demonstrating an awareness of your own emotions, demonstrating an awareness of your strengths and weaknesses, demonstrating an awareness of external supports, demonstrating a sense of personal responsibility. So as with the other competencies that we've discussed, we're going to sort of focus in on one dimension because really this is a fairly large complex of competencies, and it would be a lot to take them all on today. So as you might anticipate from the poll content, today we're going to focus on 1B, demonstrate an awareness of their personal traits, including their strengths. So we're going to focus on children's awareness of their own strengths and weaknesses. One of the reasons to focus on this is because it is one of the specific ways to operationalize self-awareness that exists in many states' SEL standards, not just Michigan's. The other one that shows up a lot is demonstrating an awareness of emotions. So if we had time, we'd talk about that too, but I'd say both of those pieces in terms of self-awareness are particularly important in terms of competencies children are expected to know and be able to demonstrate at different grade levels. And they're particularly helpful because I think that they're the clearest competencies in terms of being able to envision what they look like and being able to envision how to measure and address the competencies. But today we're going to focus on 1B. So let's talk for a second about why self-awareness matters. All right, so we want to, as we have in past episodes of our webinar series, really ground our discussion about the social emotional competence in the real world, because this page has a lot of words. In fact, it only has words, and words only take you so far. Let's see what this actually looks like in practice. So a couple of real world examples. First, I want you to imagine a young man who's studying for a test. And think about the things that are really important for his successful studying experience, for his ability to prepare himself to be successful on the test. Well, I think we could probably all agree that for this young man to succeed in studying for the test, it'll be really important for him to be able to appraise his own strengths and his own weaknesses in the content area he's studying for. So what does it take for him to study the right materials at the right level of intensity for the right amount of time to be successful? Well, he has to know what he's mastered, what he hasn't yet mastered, what he needs to work on. And that is a classic example of self-awareness in terms of understanding strengths and weaknesses. And it's not just studying for tests, it's really any endeavor that we engage in, that children engage in or that adults engage in, where there's a motive to master material, that one of the prerequisites to getting to mastery is being able to appraise accurately where you are in terms of your level of competence. Okay, so that's one, I think, specific concrete example that I hope grounds our discussion in something visualizable. It's not just in the academic arena, though, that social awareness is helpful. Self-awareness, sorry. Self-awareness is, we know from a lot of research, a key predictor of children's behavioral and social interactions and their social success. And I want to take an extreme example that's not necessarily reflective of these children. This is just from a stock photo, so I don't know these kids. But children, there's a lot of research showing that children with ADHD, okay, children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, often, not always, but often overestimate their social skills and underestimate their level of impulsivity. And we know that the more they either overestimate their social skills or underestimate their impulsivity, the worse they tend to do in interactions with peers. Specifically, they tend to use more aggressive strategies in their interactions with peers. Okay? This is true of children with ADHD, that self-image accuracy is related to, or self-awareness is related to, the quality of their interactions with others. It's not just children with ADHD, though. It's typically developing children, too. And I want to share with you some of the things that we've learned from our own data. And we're actually working to write this work up for publication. But I want you to imagine that a bunch of children had completed self-report measures of social competence. So they basically filled out a questionnaire saying how skilled they think they are in the social emotional arena. And those same children completed a direct assessment of social and emotional competence, either SELweb or direct assessment or similar kinds of assessment. So what you have here is the ingredients for evaluating children's self-awareness. You've got their appraisals of their competence and a more objective measure of their competence. Okay, do you follow me so far? Okay, so in 3 separate data sets, we looked at the relationship between accuracy in children's self-appraisals of their social competence and outcomes that we care about. So let's take one kind of student, an accurate student. So this is student A, and student A in the self-report questionnaire rated his abilities, social competence, relatively low. And it turned out when this student completed a more objective assessment of social and emotional competence, that actually was consistent with the student's self-appraisal. So this student, we would say, is self-aware. They have some social skills challenges, and they know that. Here's another kind of student who is accurate and self-aware. Student B rated social competence kind of middle of the pack. And when she completed a more objective measure of social and emotional competence, it turned out that was about right. Okay, so both these students are accurate in terms of self-awareness. They have different levels of social competence, but they are similar in their accurate appraisals of their competence level. And finally, you have student C, who appraises his social and emotional competence pretty high, and it turns out on objective measures actually scores pretty high. So similarly, just like A and B, C is self-aware by this definition of accurately appraising one's own abilities. Okay? So this is one kind of a way to operationalize accuracy. Well, what about students who aren't quite on the mark? Let's talk about overestimators. We'll talk about 2 students, student D and student E. So student D on this direct assessment of social and emotional competence struggled. had a bit of a tough time. On the self-report questionnaire, student D said, actually, I'm pretty good at these social emotional skills. And so what does that mean? Well, there's a gap between the quote unquote objectively measured social and emotional competence and students' self-appraisal of competence. Okay, this is a student who's overestimating his social and emotional competence. Self-reported social emotional competence higher than objectively measured social and emotional competence. Here's student E. Student E scored, above average, did pretty well on this objective measure. And student E thinks that he's really, really good at these competencies. So again, there is a discrepancy between the student's self-report of social and emotional competence and his objective measure of social and emotional competence. Now you'll notice though that even though both of these students are overestimators, this student's level of overestimation is higher, and this student's level of overestimation is lower or smaller. So you can quantify, if you have these two measures, my appraisal of my own competence and an objective measure of my competence, you can quantify the extent to which students are either accurate or inaccurate in their appraisals. You're going to bear with me a second here. I know this is a little bit long-winded, but we're going to get to a really, really interesting punchline, I promise. All right, let's take a look at another kind of student, underestimators. This is students F and student G. I bet you could probably draw on these sort of high-low continua, little triangles that represent underestimators, but let's take a look at F. So F scores a little below average on the direct assessment of social and emotional competence, but F thinks that her actual level of competence is actually lower. So this student underestimates her abilities. G scores really high on this objective measure of social and emotional competence, but thinks that he's kind of middle of the pack. So again, there's a discrepancy, an underestimate. The student underestimates his own abilities. And again, the discrepancy, the size of the discrepancy is different, where F is a slight underestimator and G is a fairly large underestimator. Okay, so I hope you get the concept. If there are any questions or there's any confusion, go ahead and ask in the Q&A poll and I will try to clarify. But the important part is coming up next, which is why does it matter whether students are self-aware when you measure self-awareness in this way? Okay, so let me walk you through this general way of depicting the relationship between student accuracy, which is on the x-axis, and outcomes that we care about, which is on the y-axis. Okay, so the center point of the axis is most self-aware. The further left you go, the further students underestimate their abilities. The further right you go, the further they overestimate their abilities. Okay, so the midpoint is accurate. This is underestimation. This is overestimation. And these outcomes, we have several different outcomes, but let's imagine for the moment we're looking at a positive outcome that we care about, like teacher report of positive social behavior. So my question, if we're here together, I'd have you actually draw what you think the relationship is between self-awareness and outcomes. For example, it's possible that the relationship looks like this, that the more students overestimate, or the higher their estimation of their own abilities related to their actual abilities, the better they do on positive outcomes. That's one possibility. It's also possible that the opposite is true, that the higher students overestimate their the worse that they tend to do on outcomes that we care about. That's a second possibility. And there is, of course, a third possibility, which is that students who are accurate tend to display the most positive outcomes, and then the more they underestimate their abilities, the worse the outcomes, and the more they overestimate their abilities, the worse the outcomes. I want you to think to yourself, which of those three graphs do you think reflects the relationship between self-awareness and positive outcomes? You don't have to put it in the Q&A window, but I am going to show you what we found with our data. Okay, so let's look at problem behaviors first. Okay, so these are behaviors like teacher-reported disruptive behavior and internalizing behavior. Here's what the relationship looked like. Okay, so the more self-aware students were, the lower their problem behaviors were. The more they underestimated or overestimated their abilities, the more teachers and peers reported problem behaviors. Okay, so self-awareness in this case was related to the absence of problem behaviors. What about with positive outcomes? What did that graph look like? Well, in looking at several different positive outcomes, we found the opposite relationship, or the same but inverted relationship, that the more self-aware students were, the higher the positive outcomes. Conversely, the more underestimation, the lower the positive outcomes, the more overestimation, the lower the positive outcomes. And this was across several different data sets with several different kinds of measures of positive outcomes. So what we see here is that self-awareness, being accurate in your appraisals of your ability, is associated with higher levels of positive outcomes in terms of behavior, peer relationships, interaction quality, and lower levels of problem behavior, including externalizing and internalizing behavior. Knowing yourself is important. All right. So then, we have a blog post available that I would encourage you to go to if you want to read about this in more depth. It kind of goes over these steps more carefully. And you can find the blog post here at this URL. And it talks about what we just discussed in a little bit more depth. Okay, so if that's what self-awareness is, how in the heck do we actually assess it in a meaningful way? Okay, how do you know if somebody's accurate? Well, there are several kinds of formal assessment. Actually, they're not several. There are a couple of kinds of formal assessment strategies that are commonly used to measure self-awareness. One of them is self-report, where students rate their own competence, and that is often characterized as self-awareness. Okay, that's a way to measure self-awareness. But the problem, as we've seen, is that children's and adults' ratings of their own competencies can be accurate, can represent underestimation, or can represent overestimation. So self-report alone is actually not a great way of getting at self-awareness. Okay? I know this is a bit of a mind bender, and I wish I could see your faces and see whether this is resonating, whether I'm overdoing it or underdoing it, but I hope that you're following the general logic of this. Okay, so if that's not a great way to formally assess self-awareness, what is? Well, in the fall, we're going to be incorporating a self-awareness module as part of our direct assessment of social and emotional competence. And how this is going to work is that on the one hand, we're going to have 4 self-report items where students rate their own competencies. And I know how to work out problems. I know what other people are feeling. I know how to calm down when I'm upset, and I know how other people are feeling. These are sort of broad statements about social and emotional competencies that we will also measure using direct assessment. So we'll have a self-report measure, or a direct assessment of social problem solving, a direct assessment of emotion recognition, a direct assessment of emotion regulation, and a direct assessment of social perspective taking. And what we'll be able to do with the combination of direct assessment and self-report is look at the difference between children's self-reported competencies and their directly assessed competencies to give an index of self-awareness. How aware are children really of these specific competencies? So it'll be the first assessment that we're aware of that is available to look at this question of how much are kids truly aware of their strengths and needs in the social and emotional domain. Now, I think that, though, that for most of you, the more important and salient question is going to be how more informally can we assess children's self-awareness? How do you know whether kids are self-aware. And it may be that there are things that you can incorporate in the normal flow of the day that can get at this question of self-awareness. One is self-reflection exercises. So asking students to actually take a moment to step back and appraise their own level of skill in areas that are important. This could be, hey, we're going to be doing a math test next week. I want you to write a paragraph about your math competencies, what you feel like you've mastered, what you feel like you need to master, and be able to look at students' narrative self-appraisals and compare them to their actual appraisals. You can do this in the social and emotional arena too. If a child is having behavioral difficulties, or you think they need to work on a behavior, to say, hey, tell me a little bit about how you feel that you get along with other kids. What have you mastered? What are you still working on? What do you think you need help with? And see whether the child's self-appraisals match what you're observing. It's not as quantitative or as systematic as giving a test and giving a self-report questionnaire, but I think you can get a lot of rich data, and you can get it very frequently on how aware children are of their own competency levels. A second and kind of related way of getting at self-awareness is students predict their performance on upcoming assignments or tasks or tests or exams. So how do you think you're going to do on the math test next week? And why do you think that? And then look at how the child did perform on the math test and compare their predictions about their performance to their actual performance. How do you think it's going to go when you are on the playground with other children and there's a lot of unstructured time? What do you think is going to go well? What do you think is not going to go well? So having children predict their performance and then report back on how it actually went to compare predictions to reality is, I think, a nice way to informally assess self-awareness. And then debriefing exercises. So after both of these kinds of exercises, both self-reflection and prediction of performance, afterwards, sitting down with the child and say, hey, let's talk about the relationship between your own self-appraisal and how you did on this test or how you did with these friends. What do you think about that? What do you think about where it matched up, where it didn't match up? And where it didn't match up, there are opportunities for students to kind of right-size their self-appraisal to be more commensurate with their actual performance. Okay, so these are some of the ways that at least I thought of that I think it would be reasonable and feasible to actually do informal assessment of self-awareness. And by the way, in the process, strengthen the relationship with students. Okay, so we talked a little bit about assessment. It's a little bit more of a challenge to assess than other competencies, but it is possible to do, and we're making advances in that area. Well, how do you address self-awareness? How do you help a student become more self-aware? How do you help them to demonstrate an awareness of their personal traits and including their strengths? Well, I want to share with you an example from a program called Move This World, which is a video-based set of exercises that span the CASEL competencies, including self-awareness, that I think puts into a really concrete form the sort of exercise that I believe promote students' self-awareness, defined as an accurate appraisal of their own abilities. Take a look at this, and then let's discuss. Uh-oh, is there no sound on this? Well, it turns out there's no sound on this. So I'm going to take one moment to try to actually turn the sound on, because this is pretty darn cool. And if that doesn't work, then we're going to have to go ahead and forego it. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm really sorry about that. This exercise was really about students basically saying what are their goals and what are their strengths that they'll need to be able to achieve those goals. What do they need to work on to achieve those goals? And what resources do they need to pull on in order to develop the competencies needed to achieve their goals? My sort of dramatic reenactment of this is not nearly as good as these charismatic people actually walking through this exercise. But believe me, it's a very strong exercise. And the nice thing about it is it's basically asking children, in this case, I think this is for late elementary school, for late elementary students to identify something important to them and then figure out what they need to have mastered to accomplish that thing. I think all of us feel like mastery and self-awareness is more motivating when we're going towards something that's important to us. And we're actually more likely to do an accurate inventory of our abilities if it's in service to getting someplace we want to. So apologies again for not being able to show this, but it's a nice formal exercise, and they have a number of them that focus on self-awareness. I think I need to screen share again. Can you still hear me?
Yes, Clark.
Okay, thank you. I just had a moment of Zoom paranoia. Okay, so let's go on to the next screen. Actually, somebody raised a hand. Okay, that must mean that she can still hear me. So thank you, Anne, for doing that. Okay, so let's go on to the next screen. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some informal methods. So there are means of explicit instruction that I think help students to develop a more fine-tuned sense of who they are and what their level of competence is in domains that are important to them. What are some day-to-day things that you can do to help and reinforce the sense of self-awareness? Let's talk about a couple possibilities. One of them that I think it's so straightforward as to be almost silly to mention, but is really important, is giving students accurate feedback about their level of mastery, whether it's in the social and emotional arena or the academic arena. Where students have mastered material, of course, let them know. Where students haven't material, of course, let them know that too. I think the hard part about giving feedback, and you know this better than I because you're all in the classroom every day or in the virtual classroom every day, that giving feedback about areas for improvement can sometimes be difficult for us to give and for students to receive. But we know that when students receive feedback about areas for improvement and they know that they have support for making those improvements, this is a highly motivating thing. And I believe it's going to be highly useful for them to develop an accurate appraisal of their own competencies. So consider reflecting yourselves on the ways that you give feedback about areas for improvement and the ways that when you do that, you can offer a real and concrete support for mastering those topics that are areas for improvement. I also think that educators have a wonderful opportunity in their classrooms and in their relationships with students to create a culture of productive failure, communicating early and often that failure is expected and is part of the learning process, and that it's okay to fail as long as what happens from that failure is that learning occurs. That's kind of key, and there's no simple one-shot way to create that culture of failure, but I do think communicating it explicitly and demonstrating it, and when students fail or have a hard time with something, showing them how to convert that failure into learning and to grow from it, I think gives students a chance to really put themselves out there. And only by failing also can we really test the limits of our competence. And that's why I think creating a culture of productive failure is important to develop for students to develop their sense of their own strengths and weaknesses. Related to this is promoting a kind of mastery or personal best culture. You know, there was a lot of research that came out in the 80s and 90s on the differences in student outcomes in classrooms where the focus was more on performance and competition, you know, being the best in the class, essentially, beating the pack, versus mastering specific material and being the best that you can be. Very different. One is looking to the left and looking to the right and seeing, am I doing better than my classmates? The second is not looking at the other classmates, but looking at myself and what have I mastered and what have I not mastered, and how do I take myself from where I am right now to where I'm going next. And I think this more mastery, personal best culture is, first of all, we know that it produces more engagement, more intrinsic motivation, and more success over the long haul than a performance orientation. But I also think one of the fringe benefits of a mastery or personal best culture is that it pushes students to know themselves, to know their own strengths and weaknesses. Because if you're going to get a personal best, you have to know where you're starting, and you have to know what that personal best is reflected by. So I think this is a really key element that has lots and lots of benefits, including in terms of promoting self-awareness. And then finally, this is related to the Move This World exercise that I was unfortunately unable to show you, is kind of values, affirmations, exercises, and tying mastery to personally relevant goals. We know that when students see their work and their efforts as serving goals that are relevant to them, to ends that they care about, they're more likely to be motivated and engaged. And I believe that they're more likely to look inward to figure out what resources they have available to achieve those goals and which ones are more of a stretch. So these are fairly general concepts about instruction, but my hypothesis is that the more each one of these is brought to life in a classroom setting, the more students will develop an acute sense of themselves as learners with strengths and weaknesses, and the more accurate their appraisals of their own strengths and weaknesses will be. Okay, so I'm close to the end of the formal part of the presentation, but I felt like with this discussion about self-awareness, we focused on 1B, demonstrating awareness of personal traits, including strengths. And that's important. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention how important I think 1A is also, demonstrating an awareness of emotions. And this goes back, if you are interested in this topic, I'd encourage you to go to our webpage, to the webinar recordings, and look at the episode that's focused on self-management. Because a lot of self-management, the ability to voluntarily modulate our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors in service to a goal, a lot of that is predicated on the understanding of our own emotional states. It's very hard to regulate your own emotions if you're not aware of those emotions as you're experiencing them. And although that sounds like a very simple proposition, and in many ways, intellectually, it is a simple proposition, to put it into practice is a much harder thing to do, especially for young children. In fact, one of the developmental jobs of early childhood is to recognize feelings in oneself and have a name for those feelings. Because you know from your own experience with young children, when they get very, very upset, often they're not sure what it is that they're experiencing, and simply labeling their emotions and helping them develop a vocabulary to describe their own emotions is an essential precursor to helping them learn to manage those emotions and also experience those emotions as part of the learning process moving forward. So I linger on this a little bit because I don't want to give short shrift to how important awareness of one's own emotional states is to the developmental process and to our social and emotional learning efforts with students. Okay, so before we wrap up and take some any questions or thoughts that you have, we have one more webinar episode in this series coming up on, I believe it's responsible decision making. So we're going to have covered the 5 CASEL constructs. So that's next week, same time. Stay tuned. But as we come to a close of this webinar series, I wanted to ask you all, many of whom have been to several of these webinars, if you wouldn't mind taking a minute and typing into the chat window any thoughts you have, any requests you have about topics that for future webinars that we might consider hosting that you would find particularly useful as you pursue your SEL work. So I'm going to stop for just about a minute and a half, and just let you think about what topics you would find most useful. And if you wouldn't mind typing them into the chat window, I'd be really grateful.
And Clark, in this time, I think we have a couple of questions you could address from earlier in the presentation.
You know, let's actually wait for a sec, give people a chance to have some think time and and write their responses in the chat window, because I don't want, I don't know about everybody else, but my listening and thinking skills simultaneously are very poorly developed. I have that level of self-awareness. So let's give folks a little bit to just think about what they'd like and type it into the chat window, and then we'll tackle questions.
Okay,
Thanks,
great.
Rebecca. Okay, keep the ideas coming in. I don't want to stop your thinking. I've got a number of wonderful suggestions. And if you think of others, don't let the fact that I'm about to answer some questions interfere with your thinking process. But keep them coming in. And in the meantime, Rebecca, let's go ahead and address those questions that have come in.
Let's see, let's start with, how would you go about doing self-assessment, self-reflection with younger students, like the pre-K crowd?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, pre-K is, I mean, kids really don't develop in some senses a stable self-concept until they're more in the kind of middle childhood years, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. On the other hand, children's awareness of the consequences of their behavior, I think, is something that can be promoted when a child, let's take a positive example for a second. If a very young child does something really kind and helpful for another child, simply shining a light on that and noticing it, and doing almost the play-by-play thing of saying, hey, you helped out this child to do the following activity. That was really helpful. Then the child hears it. They have a moment to reflect on it, because in the moment, young children, and by the way, adults, aren't always reflective about their own behavior. They're simply doing. So being a kind of sportscaster of young children's behavior can help them become aware of what they're doing, and also help them become aware of the consequences of their behavior. So you did that really nice thing. I bet that made that person feel really good. And you can use that same strategy for more difficult behavior. But often I would focus on the emotion of more challenging behavior and helping students become self-aware. So if a child is dysregulated or upset or being impulsive, try to help them label the emotion. I see that you're feeling really frustrated right now. It's really hard to be frustrated, right? And so then the child, you're not focusing on the negative behavior or shaming them. You're helping them to be aware of the feeling that gives rise to the behavior that you're concerned about. It's not easy to do. It's one of those things, again, that's simple, but not easy to always pull off. But I think that for all of us, adults in the lives of children, we have this opportunity to shine a light on things that help students understand themselves, understand and learn and grow. I think we do this a lot, no matter what. I mean, this isn't magic that I'm talking about. Really good educators just do this naturally, but this is something that you can reflect on in your own practice. How might I use this idea of myself as a flashlight? Simply calling the plays as I see them and giving voice to some of these behaviors so that students can internalize a sense of themselves. I think that it's something that all of you are well equipped to do. And I'd encourage you to flex those muscles and see how it works out in your own practice.
And then there's one more question about how self-rating prior to an assessment, such as a math test or a spelling test, would affect an outcome on that test. Do you think it makes a student more nervous, or do you think it improves their scoring?
You know, I have to guess that it would, over the long haul, be really helpful, and maybe even over the short haul. I mean, if you're asking students, you know, I showed that picture of that student studying for a test, and let's think about that student. If that student were asked, you know, how prepared do you feel for that test, and we're able to reflect on it and accurately appraise where he was ready and where he wasn't ready. To me, that seems like it would be setting the student up for studying successfully. Okay, so my hypothesis is that self-appraisal and prediction of performance can help students really hone in on what they need to focus on. Is it possible that it would make them nervous? Yes, it is possible that it would make them nervous, because for most of us, focusing on things that we haven't mastered can be anxiety producing. But you know, what is the learning process but really actually working on things that we haven't learned yet? And so I think the more that students can self-appraise where they're strong and where they're not strong, without judgment, without feeling badly about themselves, but just being able to accurately gauge it, the more helpful that's going to be over the long haul. I really think that is actually kind of supported by the self-esteem movement from the 70s, where the kind of vogue of the moment was that the more students felt good about themselves, the better they would do in school. And it turned out really not to be true, that students can feel really, really good about themselves and still do very poorly in school. So the self-esteem movement had, I think, a misconception that just feeling great is what is the main driver for being successful. I would argue that yes, feeling great is a good thing, and knowing what you need to master is a good thing too. So being able to feel good about yourself and being able to know what you're not good at and what you need to work on are two essential precursors to success. What else?
Any last questions?
No, Clark, I have a question. This is Ryan.
Yes.
Hi. Have you seen anything in the research or the data that you've been looking at with regard to this dynamic between self-rating and performance-based assessment that would discriminate the approach that you would take of underestimators versus overestimators, as far as an intervention one might take?
No, not necessarily. I think that's still a bit of an open question, but I would say, one thing that we know from not our research, but from the research, body of research in general, is that students who maybe have a tendency to externalizing or disruptive behavior, whether it's ADHD or not, who overestimate their social and emotional competence tend to display more aggressive behavior than students who are more accurate in their appraisals. So to me, that kind of suggests that for children with disruptive behavior, it may be particularly helpful when they think that they're just doing awesome with peers and that they have all kinds of social skills, to gently help them recalibrate their self-appraisal to bring it more into line with their actual competence level. Now, again, that's a bit of a hard pill to swallow, because you're basically saying, hey, you kind of feel overly good about yourself in this area. So you don't want to say that in a way that is hurtful. And I think the best tonic against that being a negative experience for students is to make sure that alongside the feedback, you give students very concrete and heartfelt messages that we're going to support you in developing these competencies. This is actually a struggle for you, and here's what we're going to do to help you get there. It's really helpful, because a lot of times I get the feeling that for those students, they overestimate their abilities as a kind of protective mechanism, and you don't want to take away the protection without offering to substitute it for something real and valuable. So that's the kind of one specific thing I could think of that seems like it would be potentially indicated for that population of students. But I think that, for underestimaters, praising their abilities and making sure that they know how well they're doing and is going to be helpful, so that they really have an accurate sense of where they're at, whether it's academically, socially, or emotionally. And but to the same by the same token, for overestimators, giving them feedback that helps them bring their expectations and self-image into line with their actual mastery level is going to be important too.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Clark and Ryan. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And this week's follow-up email, we will include a link to the video of Move This World that we weren't able to show. So we will attach that to an email that you'll be receiving for attending. And I hope to see you next week at Part 6, Responsible Decision Making. Thank you.